Hey everyone, Joe Crawl with the Society of St. Sebastian, and welcome to our weekly update. This week we're going to be defending pro-life incrementalism against some myths that have been perpetrated by another movement called abolitionism. Interestingly enough, when we talk about abolitionism, they too want to overturn Roe, just like us in the pro-life movement do. But their approach to overturning Roe is philosophically very, very different than what we as a pro-life movement want to do. Basically, for those of you that don't know, this movement has been gaining some traction in various states, and they've been proposing legislation. And again, most of these legislative initiatives you may have heard of, they're complete bans on abortion. So we're going to look at some of their, I guess you could say, myths that they have about the pro-life movement or criticisms of the pro-life movement. And my job is to sort of debunk these, all right? Firstly, let me just start with the myth that pro-life incrementalism is not scriptural. I disagree with that wholeheartedly. As someone who has an advanced degree in Catholic theology, who has studied scripture at an advanced level, who has had to teach classes in theology and so forth, all I can say is that the gospel, and particularly the Bible, the whole of it is an exercise in incrementalism. God has provided us with a great model on how to change a culture radically. Now, again, one of the things to note is that, God doesn't just reveal himself all at once. After man's fall, it's a gradual revelation. And we receive the fullness of that revelation in Jesus, in the New Testament. But over the course of the time, we see gradual development. I think this provides us with a great model. And even Jesus says, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. And certainly myself as a Christian and anyone else who is a Christian certainly recognizes Jesus as God. And if Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, and God is providing us with a model here, indeed, we can model after what God has done to help change culture. One of the things that I think we need to recognize, especially from a scriptural point of view, is why does God do this incrementally? Well, I think the answer becomes obvious, is because we live in time. We are subject to time. We get older. We age, a newborn infant certainly doesn't look the same as he does when he becomes 20 years old. We mature and so forth. Even trying to become a good and holy person, a virtuous person, takes time. It takes effort. It takes habits that need to be made. A person just simply does not go to sleep one night and wake up and all of a sudden they're virtuous. This is something that takes a lot of practice. And as they say, practice makes perfect. So the idea that somehow incrementalism isn't scriptural is, simply put, not looking at scripture as a whole. It's kind of ignoring the very big picture when it comes to the idea of scripture and incrementalism. So to say that it's not scriptural is just, simply put, wrong. The other big myth that many of these folks have is that, as I said a moment ago, is they want elected officials, especially state elected officials, to simply ignore Roe and either enforce pre-Roe laws that prohibit abortion to be enforced, or to have the state pass laws that ban abortion and then have those enforced. Now, it sounds nice on the surface, but if you kind of uncover the layers, especially the surface layer, you begin to see some major problems. I think the big problem that we have to face with respect to this sort of philosophy is that it tends to ignore what the Constitution is, all right, and what it does and what it accomplishes. Many of these abolitionists, and especially the ones that are writing in nationally known publications, try to talk about what's called the doctrine of the lesser magistrates, meaning that, you have the king at the top and then you have his lower lords and vassals, if you will. And if the king makes an edict, if you will, that's unjust, the lower magistrates don't have an obligation to follow it. In fact, they should ignore it and so forth, and try to force the king, if you will, to change this unjust law. Right? And it really, this sort of doctrine operates typically, from what we've seen, in systems where there is monarchy. This is one of the reasons why the Magna Carta was signed, for example, back in medieval times. It's one of the reasons why our revolutionary founding fathers had the American Revolution. Again, they could do nothing against the English Parliament and the king. Taxation without representation. And so, again, this was a way to try to force the king's hand, if you will, and Parliament's hand to hear them and so forth. I think our particular problem, though, in today's society when it comes to this sort of idea is that we got to remember our founding fathers understood what kind of a tyrannical sort of government was, where you could not change unjust law. And in their genius, they devise a system under the Constitution where unjust laws can be changed. And there's several ways that you can look at this. So, for example, a legislature passes an unjust law. The legislature can either come back and change that unjust law at another date, or even that law can be challenged in court. And if it's found to be unconstitutional, it's simply not enforced and it becomes void. With greater constitutional law, if you will, again, there's several avenues that are provided within the Constitution. Now, we got to remember, we have men that operate in our government, and they're not perfect, and unfortunately, sometimes unjust laws will be made. And Roe is a prime example of this. I mean, just a tragic case. Roughly 60 million babies have been killed because of Roe v. Wade. We all know that it's an unjust law. But our founding fathers didn't want people just simply not to have any sort of avenue if one of the major branches came down with a law. Right? They wanted to provide several avenues that could be available to the governed. And so within Article 5, we certainly see two possibilities, two ways to even get an amendment passed that could overturn Roe. So we got to remember, in the Constitution, can be amended. And, U.S. Supreme Court decisions certainly can be overturned through the amendment process. Either Congress can start the process in which they start proposing amendments and then it goes to the states, or the states can call for a convention of states and they can start the amendment process. And that's already two ways that are available under the Constitution. In Article 3 of the Constitution, it sets up the court system. And again, it's very possible that the courts can overturn themselves. We've certainly seen it in our own American history, and the biggest example that we can talk about is how Brown versus the Board of Education overturned Plessy v. Ferguson. Brown versus Board of Education basically said segregation is unconstitutional. It was a foundational case. And again, we saw an injustice that had been perpetrated by the U.S. Supreme Court overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court. I think it's important to note that we just can't ask elected officials to ignore these provisions within the Constitution. And I think to some extent that's what these abolitionists are doing, unfortunately, is asking elected officials to ignore these provisions within the Constitution. Right? We know, for example, that Roe v. Wade is the law of the land. But we also know that this is not a law that's going to be just simply overturned anytime soon. Certainly with the recent Indiana case back in May, where they upheld one portion of the Indiana law that allowed for humane fetal burial for those unborn children that are killed by abortion. They upheld that provision of the law, but they basically allowed the other law to be struck down, which was, the law that mandated that those that have disabilities and so forth shouldn't be aborted. They struck down that portion of the law, or rather, I should say, the appellate court struck it down, and the Supreme Court allowed that lower court decision on that provision to stand. So we know the mood of the U.S. Supreme Court, but I think it's important to note here, at least again from sort of a political, philosophical perspective, that You just can't ask people to deny the Constitution. The Founding Fathers knew, they knew firsthand that changing laws within government is something important. And they incorporated that within the Constitution in a way that is peaceful, that is civilized, and doesn't cause massive disruption. And those laws are indeed just laws. We can't ask people just to ignore just laws that are within the Constitution itself. This provides for a great way for us to do this sort of thing. If you have people ignore provisions of the Constitution, in many ways you cause chaos, because then what you get is some people saying, well, I don't like that part of the Constitution, I'm not going to do it. Or we as a state, we don't believe in the Electoral College, whatever. We're just going to go with the popular vote. You create a situation where there's chaos. People just can't willy-nilly forget portions of the Constitution. So it's important to know that in many ways, these legislators that are asked to do this are asked to do this in a peaceful way that helps establish a culture of life. I think we in the pro-life movement, certainly from a moral point of view and a legal point of view, have always stressed this, that this needs to be something that's peacefully done, that's done correctly, that's done in a moral way. And staying within the bounds of a just law, such as is provided within the Constitution, to overturn just laws is the way that we need to proceed. Anyway, thank you for your time. And as always, we appreciate everything. So, give us a big thumbs up. And again, have a blessed weekend. God bless.